All right, hello, MUCT 112L, first year, second quarter ear training students. This is your remote lecture for week 9. Okay, let's go ahead and warm up. We're going to warm up, then we're going to introduce a concept that we dealt with briefly on Friday before going back and getting and singing through some of those things again. So we've got plenty to do. Let's start with a good warm-up. Start with the major mode, 2, 3, 4, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, ti, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do. Let's go to chromatic now. 2, 3, 4, do, di, re, mi, fa, fi, sol, si, la, li, ti, do, ti, te, la, le, sol, se, fa, mi, me, re, ra, do. Ooh, I was way off on that one, so you guys can figure out which way off. I think I was quite a bit high. Let's do natural minor. 2, 3, 4, do, re, mi, fa, sol, le, te, do, te, le, sol, fa, mi, re, do. And let's do harmonic. 2, 3, 4, do, re, mi, fa, sol, le, ti, do, ti, le, sol, fa, mi, re, do. All right. So let's jump in to a little bit of a closer examination of the seventh chords that we introduced on Friday. Remember, we sat around the piano and we talked about 5 different kinds of seventh chords. So let's review briefly what makes a seventh chord a seventh chord. As we mentioned, a triad is merely a stack of 3/3. That's what a triad, hence the name triad, meaning 3. It's a stack of thirds. So if you want to make a seventh chord, you stack another third on top. It is called a seventh chord because of the interval between the lowest note and the highest note in the chord is an interval of a seventh, one kind or another. Okay, and so we are going to learn 5 different kinds, or we're going to review. We've learned them already. And I want to make sure you should take notes. You should take notes about the specific identification, the vocabulary terms we're using to identify them, because it's important. Very often, this seventh chord here is just called a major seventh chord. And that is correct in a sense, but it's not as complete as I would like it, because when we are dealing with a seventh chord, I like to identify 2 things. One of them is the triad, the other is the seventh. So we have the triad here, and we have the seventh here. So first, I would like to identify the triad. As we can see, the do, mi, and sol, we have a major triad. We know that already. If we look at the seventh, do to ti, we have a major seventh. So major, major seventh. So major, major seventh. That's the way that I will identify them from now on. And then we'll learn what all these are, and then we'll distinguish between them. Okay. So if we start again with a major triad, and we add a minor seventh to the top, we have a major minor seventh. Okay. And sometimes people will call this the dominant seventh, or we'll call it the 5/7, because this is most often seen as a 5/7 chord. Better to call it by its strict identification as major triad, a minor seventh, major minor seventh. That way, if it is ever used in a non-dominant function, meaning not tonicizing a certain note or going to the 1 chord, then it will not be confused for that. So major minor seventh. Okay, we'll continue. This time we will start with a minor triad and a minor seventh. That is the minor, minor seventh. Then we add a diminished triad. Note the say here, the G flat, making a diminished triad, with the minor seventh, diminished minor seventh. This is often also known as the half diminished seventh. Circle with a slash through it for half diminished seventh chord. Either one of those is acceptable. Both are known. They wouldn't be confused with anything else. And then we have the diminished triad again. And see the double flat, the B double flat, a diminished seventh. This is often known as the fully diminished seventh chord. You can use those terms interchangeably. So as you can see, we have 5 distinct seventh chords. Now, as I believe Nadalyn was asking in last Friday's class, there should be more, aren't there more examples or more possibilities of seventh chords than these? Yes, certainly. You could have a major triad with a major seventh, minor seventh, diminished seventh, minor triad with the same, all different kinds of things that you could do. Notice there are no augmented triads used here at all. These 5 are by far, almost without exception, the 5 that are used in almost all of Western tonal music. I mean, getting into the late 19th century, into the 20th century, certainly. We're dealing with a lot more, and jazz uses just a huge number of 7th and 9th and 11th and 13th chords. But as far as the harmony, the standard common practice triadic harmony that you guys are dealing with, these are the 5 chords that are used. Okay. So, how to distinguish between these 5 chords? This is what we talked about on Friday. There are 2 kind of general categories that I divide the seventh chords into. One is static, the other is tension. Static and tension. Okay, what I mean by static is the chord doesn't have an overwhelming need to move to something else. Okay. The idea is if you could end a song on this chord, we might consider that to be more of a static chord. Okay. A tension chord is one that has a syllable or a degree within it that needs to move in one direction. In the case of the chords that we're talking about, it's a seventh that needs to move down. Okay, if you remember your voice leading for the 5-7 chord, that seventh needs to move down. This is actually what we're talking about here. So let's distinguish between the 2 kinds of static and tension chords. So let's start with the static chords. I'll identify them right now. And this will be interesting because it's kind of both. This is a special case we'll talk about in a moment. So the first static chord is major, major. So notice the major triad and the major seventh. Now the major seventh really has a lot of tension in it, and when played by itself would appear to need to resolve upward to the octave. But when coupled with the major triad below it, it doesn't have that overwhelming tendency, which is an interesting chord. It's played up an octave. And this chord we consider static because it doesn't have a strong need to move anywhere else. If you're playing Autumn Leaves or some jazzy kind of thing, you can just go right on. Playing a major chord, another major seventh, and end right there, and we would be perfectly satisfied. Okay. The other static chord is the minor minor, the third on the list. And here is how it sounds. Notice it also has a very, I think, a very jazzy, very static profile. And very often students will confuse the major and the minor sevenths. Okay, the way you can tell, there are two ways that you can tell. One is the third, especially if I roll it. If you hear do, mi, then you know you're dealing with a minor seventh. Also the seventh of the chord, do, te, those are both lowered compared to the major seventh. All right, so let's move to the tension chords. The tension chords that are marked by T's. Let's begin with the major seventh chord. Here's the major triad and the minor seventh. And we remember from the minor seventh interval that it has a tendency, somewhat of a tendency, to go down. And so does the major seventh chord. For that to go down. Okay. I just resolved to a tonic triad. So you hear that sense of the 7 needing to move downward. Okay? It's a very similar tendency tone in the other tense chord, exclusively tense chord, the half diminished or diminished minor 7th chord. We begin with a diminished triad. Add a minor 7th. Oh, excuse me, that was not a diminished triad. There's the diminished triad. And the minor 7th. Okay, up an octave. And you hear a tendency of that 7 to want to move down. And what it moves down to, in this particular case, it feels like it wants to resolve to the diminished 7th or fully diminished 7th chord. Now the reason I identify this, both as static and as tension, is the static identification is based on the mechanics of its construction. It's a minor third, stacked by a minor third, stacked by another minor third, and then if you, to continue through your octave, you stack it with another minor third. I mean, it's written here it would be written here as an augmented second, but it's the same sound. Okay, so it's stable in the sense that the chord is equidistant, so there aren't any particular tendency tones, but it's certainly not a stable sounding chord. You would not end a piece of music, at least not a happy piece of music, on a chord like this. So it is static in the sense that it doesn't have any tendency tones move anywhere, but it's tense in the sense that it is not a stable chord. So we hear it, diminished triad, diminished 7th, together, up an octave, playing together, very tense, especially when rolled like that. Okay, so those are our identifying markers. We will drill these as we go through class. At the beginning of every class, we will go through these. We'll also, in the future, have some of the dictation assignments dealing with these a little further in the future than that. Okay, so let's focus in on one of these, because we're going to sing the outline of one of these chords, or a manifestation of one of these chords, in our Berkowitz. So let's get rid of major 7th, minor, diminished, diminished, and let's stick with a major 7th chord, particularly the most common manifestation of the major 7th chord, the 5-7. The 5-7 chord. Okay, you know the 5-7 chord from your theory class. It has a lot of really, really important syllables in it. So let's go to the key of F major. So this is all diatonic. It has sol, which is a very important syllable, T, a very, very important syllable, and fa. Okay. Two of these syllables have tendency tone functions because they are a half step away from their neighbor. T, of course, wanting to move to do, and fa wanting to move to mi. Okay, so it's kind of a double tension chord. Okay, there's 2 points of tension here. This diminished, the top part of the 5/7 chord is a diminished triad, which wants to move into that major third. So T moving to Do, Fa moving to Mi. And then you can keep this, or you can put it in inversion. You end up 5/7/1, which is the common way to resolve it. But melodically, and we're about to sing this in the Berkowitz, melodically, it's very, very important to know where you are in that chord, because it gives you a clue as to where you're going to go afterwards. If you, let's just say this is Do, Sol, Ti, Re, Fa. So if you're singing a melody that's outlining the 5/7 chord and you go Sol, Ti, Re, Fa, you've got a really good chance that your next note will be Mi. If you do it in inversion, or you do just some of the notes, if you do Sol, Fa, Re, Ti, good chance your next note is going to be Do because of the resolution from Ti to Do. All right, let's get out the Berkowitz books. Get out your Berkowitz books, please. And go to page 36. 36. All right, on page 36, we will do a couple of paired sets of the 5/7 chord. So beginning with 159, F major. Okay, don't worry about the time signature right now. Let's just sing this in a nice, slow manner. Notice you've got the 5/7 chord. Of course, they tell you what's going on. You have the 5/7 chord in the second measure, and as well as the third measure from the end. 1 ascending, 1 descending. Do, Mi, Sol. Let's try it. 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Do, Mi, Sol. Sol, Ti, Re, Fa, Mi, Re, Do, Re. Do, Mi, Sol, Fa, Re, Ti, Sol, La, Ti, Do, Re, Mi, Re, Do. All right? That's major. And in minor mode, remember that the 5/7 chord, in order for it to retain its dominant function, needs to change. So here's the key of F minor. This chord without any alteration is a minor minor seventh, which I think is very beautiful, but it doesn't have the strong dominant function. Remember, the minor minor seventh is a static chord. So if you're wanting a chord that is going to dominantly or strongly move to the 1, you need to raise the leading tone so that you have that strong leading tone to tonic relationship. And the seventh of the chord is also going to move downward as it should. Okay, so let's do that again. Do that now 160 in minor. 1, 2, 3, 4. Do, Mi, Sol, Sol, Ti, Re, Fa, Mi, Re, Do, Re. Do, Mi, Sol, Fa, Re, Ti, Sol, La, Ti, Do, Re, Mi, Re, Do. All right. Okay, so let's do a couple of examples that are not in pairs, but that stand alone. Number 161, here in the alto clef, we are in E minor. Okay, so we start with descending chord Sol, Mi, Do, and then watch the 5/7 chord in the next measure, the 3 beats of the next measure, and the first beat of the third measure. Fa, Re, Ti, Sol. Okay? Then we have, in the second half of the piece, a 4 chord, then a 1 chord, and then a 5/7 chord again. we'll sing it nice and slow, which is langsam, what we should do anyway. So, me, do, 1 and 2 and 3. So, me, do, fa, re, ti, sol, la, ti, do, re, mi, do, le, fa, sol, mi, do, fa, re, ti, sol, la, ti, do. Let's do one more. 162. 162. Here in the key of B minor. So we do start on do. And be careful in the third measure where we have the complete 5/7 chord, it does jump around just a little bit. All right, let's try this one. 1 and 2 and do, sol, me, do, ti, re, sol, ti, re, sol, fa, me, do, le, do, fa, le, sol, do, me, do, ti, sol, re, ti, fa, me, re, do. Good, and on Friday we'll spend the rest of our time on, or we'll spend some time on the rest of these 5/7 chords so we can do them all together. Okay, so hopefully you understand the principles of 7th chords and how the 5/7 chord works particularly. It's really a very, very important outline, both in singing and in accompaniment, of course, because it really underpins much of our dominant to tonic relationship, much of our triadic harmony. All right, let's do a little bit of kazez. Just a couple of examples. Go to page 61, please. Let's go to page 61. We're actually nearing the end of this chapter. We may get finished with it, actually, before the end of the quarter. In the next quarter we'll go to chapter 5, which is back to simple meter, but a different measure of the beat. But we're here in the dotted quarter note beat in compound meter. Page 61, number 112. Okay, so you see we have a tie across. This is kind of the equivalent in compound meter of like a double dotted figure in simple meter, though there really aren't double dotted figures very common in compound meter. When you're wanting something to be very long and then a very short note at the end, within a beat, a tie is generally required. Okay, let's try 112. I'll give you 2 beats. 1 and 2 and 1 E and 2 E and T T ticky T T ticky T T ticky T ticky T T T T T T T ticky T ticky T T T T T T. Of course, you should be, as always, subdividing T T T T T just in your heads. All right, let's go down to number 113, allegretto. Notice that there is a meter change between the lines here. All right, one measure and we're in. 1 and 2 and 3 and T T T T T T T T T T T T T Ki Tiki T T T Tiki T T T T T T T T Tiki T T T T Tiki 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 T. All right. Now let's do the very same thing. Turning the page over to page 62, we will do the very same thing, but without that tied across longer note that will be replaced by a rest. The short note, briefly anticipating an upbeat to the next measure, will remain. In this case, as you see in the preparatory drill in number 114, really, really important that you subdivide. You have to be thinking 1E and 1E and TT, or else it will be late. Here we go. We're in 3/8 time, so the beat and the measure is the same thing. So I'll give you 4. 1 and 1 and 1E and 1E and T, ticky T, T T, T T, T T. All right. 115, I'll give you 4. Note that the first measure has only the one note in it, but it's not an anacrusis, so that will be the starting measure will be mostly empty. But I'll give you 4 preparatory measures or beats. 1 and 1 and 1E and 1E and T T T ticky 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 T ticky T ticky T T T T T T T T T T ticky T ticky T T T T ticky 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 T T T T T T T T T T T off. Okay, and let's for our final thing today, let's just take a brief look at number 116. This is actually mostly just a review of measured tremolo. We remember from the last chapter, which was early in this quarter, what to do with measured tremolo. This is just how it looks in compound meter. So we remember that if you have any note value and you put any number of slashes, the slashes refer to flags on the note, and you've fit as many of the notes that have that flag into the note that is being slashed. So this is a dotted quarter note. So if I were to put 1 slash, how many 8th notes fit into a dotted quarter? 3. If I put 2 slashes, how many 16th notes fit into a dotted quarter? 6. The only thing to keep in mind is one that we already dealt with before, but remember that when you slash something that has a flag on it already, you add the flags. So this is 2 16th notes, an 8th and 2 16th notes, equivalent to this figure. Those are equal. So let's have a look at number 116. As you can tell, in 16A they use the slashes, 16B they realize those slashes. So let's go ahead and do 116 just to get used to it. 1 and 2 and 1E and 2E and T ticky 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 T ticky T ticky T T T T T ticky 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 T. All right, we'll continue this conversation of learning on Friday. See you then.